G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Ezekiel. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. We're into session 33. We're looking at chapter 40, verses 6 to 46. It's a chapter which is lots of numbers and figures in it. Remember, last session we finished off just looking at, we started to look at the millennial temple, and Ezekiel has given all the measurements and dimensions of the millennial temple. And you know, as we said last time, Judaism today find it difficult to comprehend chapters 40 to 48 of Ezekiel because the sacrificial system and the temple and things like that, it's different to Mosaic system, and they just can't bring it together. And so their thing is that we'll wait for Elijah to come to explain it to us because we can't comprehend it. I've given you just two slides there where we have the numbers on the temple compound, the numbers relating to the areas there, just so that as we go through it in the days ahead, you'll be able to itemize and look at these things and realize what we're talking about. Okay, so we're going to kick off. We're going to come now to chapter 40, verse 6, where we're looking at the east gate. This is the east gate of the temple compound. Then came he onto the gate which looked toward the east, and went up the steps thereof, and he measured the threshold of the gate 1 reed broad, and the other threshold 1 reed broad. And every lodge was 1 reed long and 1 reed broad. And the space between the lodges was 5 cubits, and the threshold of the gate by the porch of the gate toward the house was 1 reed. He measured also the porch of the gate toward the house 1 reed. Then measured he the porch of the gate 8 cubits, posts thereof 2 cubits, and the porch of the gate was toward the house. The lodges of the gate eastward were 3 on this side and 3 on that side. They 3 were of 1 measure, and the posts had 1 measure on this side and on that side. And he measured the breadth of the opening of the gate 10 cubits, and the length of the gate 13 cubits. And a border before the lodges, 1 cubit on this side, and a border 1 cubit on that side. The lodges 6 cubits on this side, 6 cubits on that side. And he measured the gate from the roof of the one lodge to the roof of the other, a breadth of 25 cubits, door against door. He made also posts 60 cubits, and the court reached unto the posts round about the gate. From the forefront of the gate at the entrance unto the forefront of the inner porch of the gate were 50 cubits. And there were closed windows to the lodges and to their posts within the gate round about, and likewise to the arches. And windows were round about inward, and upon each post were palm trees. Man, oh man, if you're reading that, you'd think, what is going on here? Well, now, as we deal with the details of the eastern gate, what is true of this gate will also be true of the northern and southern gates. So this is a bit of a planned diagram of what the eastern gate looked like, and by focusing attention on this diagram here, it might be a little bit easier to understand what it is like as we move through the details somewhat rapidly. Bear in mind here that as we deal with the other gates, the only difference between them is the direction towards which they face. Otherwise, basic structure is going to be the same. And you see those pointy little things there. They're windows. Look like dunce hats. They're windows. It signifies windows. All right. You'll see it as we go through. Now, in the first part of verse 6, we're brought to this gate. Then came he onto the gate which looked toward the east. So this is the outer eastern gate. So there's going to be an outer and inner wall, both of which will have 3 gates. The gate we're looking at here is the outer gate in the outer east wall. So you're going to have an outer wall and an inner wall. So it was the main approach to the temple, as we're going to see as we go through this study. And he went up the steps thereof. So we learned that there were 7 steps leading up to the entry of this gate. So what we see straight away is that this temple compound is raised. So there are 7 steps going up to the gate. In the second part of verse 6, he deals with the threshold of this gateway. And he measured the threshold of the gate 1 reed broad. So that's about 10 feet 4 inches, or 3.5 meters. We'll deal with meters here because that's what we use. 3.15 meters. So the threshold was facing the outside, and then he measured the opposite threshold, which was also 1 reed broad. Again, that is 3.15 meters, which faced the inner court. So we have the outer and the inner. So as you walk through the entryway of the eastern gate, there's one threshold facing the outside and a second threshold facing into the inner court. So they were both about 3.15 meters wide. Remember, these are only approximate equivalents to the ancient measurements, which those measurements are no longer used. So these are approximate measurement. But even then, 3.15 meters is a fair wall. And in verse 7, he talks about the lodges or guard rooms. He says every lodge was 1 reed long, 1 reed broad. So it's a square, a 3.15 meters square. And this is to serve as accommodations for the ministering priests. But they also serve as guard rooms, and we can pick that up in 2 Kings 22:4, where it talks about them as being keepers of the threshold. This is the threshold we're looking at here. Also, 1 Chronicles 9, verse 26 and 9, verse 27. So we are into now the eastern gate. Then the space between the lodges, that's between these accommodation lodges, rooms, if you like, was 5 cubits. That's about 2.7 meters. And this is the thickness of the walls. 2.7 meters is the thickness of the walls that separated one cell from the other. Now, altogether, there were 6 of these cells, or six of these lodges along the corridor or passageway of the gateway. 3 on the north side, 3 on the south side. And each of them was about 3.15 meters long or square, long and square, long and wide. And the threshold of the gate by the porch of the gate toward the house was 3.15 meters, 1 reed. So there are also some circular posts at the end of both walls of the porch, running from east to west. And remember, we're entering the east gate here, and it runs from east to west, which also had the same thickness as the wall. And in verse 8, he now talks about the first porch, and he measured also onto the porch of the gate toward the house 1 reed, or 3.15 meters. And then he measured the thickness of the wall of the porch, which was located in the interior of the gateway. And that was also 3.15 meters. And so that's why I gave you those that first image before, so you can look at what we're talking about here. The one with all the numbers on it. Now in verse 9, he deals with the second porch. Then he measured the porch of the gate 8 cubits. So this porch is about 4.27 meters. It was a dimension of the empty space of the porch from east to west, and the post thereof. The word post here can also mean door jambs, if you like, or the jambs of doors. And these were 2 cubits. These posts, that's a bit over 1 meter. And the porch of the gate was toward the house, which means it was same as in verse 7. Only this porch was now within and at the end of the gateway, which was facing towards the temple. So you come through the east gate, and then you head towards the temple. But within the gateway, the porch also faced outward, away from the temple. And then in verse 10, he talks about the lodges or the guard rooms again. And the lodges of the gate eastward were 3 on this side, 3 on that side. So this has already been mentioned in verse 7. 3 on the north side, 3 on the south side of the eastern gate. Total of 6 guard rooms. They were there of one measure. In other words, they're all the same measure, 3.15 meters square. And the post had one measure on this side and on that side. Again, just a little bit over 1 meter, according to verse 9. Then in verse 11, he tells us about the gateway opening itself. He says he measured the breadth of the opening of the gate, and this is a threshold here, which was 10 cubits or a bit over 5 meters. It is 6 cubits deep, which means it's 3.2 meters deep, but 10 cubits wide, 5.35. And according to this verse, along with verse 6, it tells us this. So I don't expect you to remember all these measurements. So just follow along as best as you can. So in dealing with the length of the gate, he says it has 13 cubits, 6.9 meters. So this is the corridor in the gateway at its broadest point between the side rooms, right? And this is where the jambs of the recessed windows are set back 1 cubit behind the border, the projecting border, or behind the low partition wall of the side rooms. You've got to be an architect to follow along with this. Now in verse 12, he deals with the border before the lodges or guard rooms. It says a border before the lodges was 1 cubit on this side and a border and 1 cubit on that side. This means it was, like half a meter. And the lodges themselves were 6 cubits on this side and 6 cubits on that side. That's 3.2 meters. Again, verse 7 and 10 tell us the same thing. And verse 13, he deals with the breadth of the gate. He measured the gate from the roof of the one lodge to the roof of the other, a breadth of 5 and 20 cubits. That would make it a bit over 13 meters. The breadth of the gateway from roof to roof was 2 cubits, equivalent again to the thickness of the wall. And since there are 2 such walls, then the way to arrive at a total of 25 cubits for the entire width of this. The wall thickness equals 1 cubit. The side rooms equals 6 cubits. The corridor was 1 cubit. That was the offset. So that's 11 cubits. Side rooms equals 6 cubits. Wall thickness equals 1 cubit. So total 25 cubits in width. So by looking from one end of this gate to the other in its breadth, you would have the cubit for the wall at one side, plus the guard rooms at 6 cubits wide, plus the width of the corridor at 11 cubits, and then another guard room at 6 cubits, plus the wall on the other side at 1 cubit, 25 cubits. Mathematicians, we can add up. So he says that this was door against door, which suggests that there was a door that led from each of the side rooms onto the outer court. Now, the door by the cell, by the gate in the south, was exactly opposite the door of the cell by the gate of the north. Now, in verse 14, he tells us about the posts. He made also the posts, which were 60 cubits or 32 meters, and the court reached onto the posts round about the gate. And then in verse 15, he deals with the length of the gate. And from the forefront of the gate at the entrance onto the forefront of the inner porch of the gate were 50 cubits, or just about 27 meters, which is the entire length of the gateway. So the breadth of this eastern gate from one end to the other was 25 cubits. The length of it was 50 cubits, making it 25 by 50 cubits in area. This is the eastern gate, one end to the other. Okay. In verse 16, he deals with the windows of the guard rooms, and there were closed windows. The Hebrew word for these windows, the meaning which is debated, is also found in 1 Kings 6:4, and it could mean one of 3 things. These are the windows. It could mean that these were shut windows, or it could mean they were lattice work windows because they had no glass, right? Or they were simply narrowed windows, which in that one of the first, the Eastern Gate diagram there, it started off wide and then narrowed to a point. It was narrow in the interior of the walls and widening at the exterior. No, it's the other way around. It's narrow. It's wide at the interior, narrow at the exterior. So the image here, so it started wide and then narrowed to a point. So the image here, it assumes the third description of what these windows look like. That is wide, narrowing to a point, and that's the image. I think it's a third slide in. The other two have equal validity there, but this one seems to fit the best. So what we have here is that there were closed windows within these lodges, which is where there was lodging for the Levite, the guards and stuff like that, and to their post within the gate round about, and likewise to their arches, and the windows were round about inward, and upon each post were palm trees. Now, these palm trees were very similar, well, are very similar, not were because we haven't built this temple yet, are very similar to those in the Solomonic temple, which we see in 1 Kings 6, 29, 32, and 35. There's the references on the slide there. Also 2 Chronicles 3, 5. Now, palm trees were a symbol of beauty, according to the Song of Solomon's, chapter 7, verse 7. They are also a symbol of the blessings of righteousness, which we see in Psalm 92, verse 12 to 14, and Revelation, chapter 7, verse 9. So, and also there are feasts, symbol of the Feast of Tabernacles, and we see this in Leviticus 23, 40, Nehemiah 8, 15, and John 12, 13. So it's so we see several things here that these are symbolic of. It's beauty, according to Solomon, righteousness, Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, now it's no accident here that palm trees play a role in the Feast of Tabernacles, because remember, we're dealing with the Messianic kingdom, right? This is where the millennial temple is. It's going to be built in the Messianic kingdom, which is the fulfillment of that feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, according to Zechariah chapter 14, verses 16 to 19. Zechariah 14, 16 to 19. Now, it's also could be pointed out now that some archaeologists have uncovered the Solomonic gates of various Solomonic cities, such as Megiddo, Hazor, and Giza. And the three gates in the north, east, and south of the outer wall in this passage are actually patterned on those ancient Solomonic city gates. So as we deal with these details, if you happen to get a bit lost here, and don't be concerned about it, because go back to the diagrams and that might alleviate a bit of confusion. If we can just catch the basic picture, all right, we'll grasp the basic structure, which should be sufficient. And in fact, Dr. Fruchtenbaum, he himself is not actually clear what all this detail means, not totally clear. And it would take an architect, as I said before, to understand everything that is going on in these particular passages. Now, in dealing with the outer court, we have dealt with the outer wall in verse 5, the eastern gate in verses 6 to 16. Now we come to a number of chambers and the pavement around the outer court in verses 17 to 19. So we have 30 chambers and the pavement around the outer court, verses 17 to 19. Then brought he me into the outer court, and lo, there were chambers and a pavement made for the court round about. 30 chambers were upon the pavement, and the pavement was by the side of the gates, answerable unto the length of the gates, even the lower pavements. Then he measured the breadth from the forefront of the lower gate unto the forefront of the inner court without, 100 cubits, both in the east and on the north. So some of these things here we will deal with the outer court area. Now this is what we see here. This is a diagram of the temple compound, and this might prove helpful while we're explaining some of the detail of this temple complex. And we're going to run with this diagram for the next several slides. Now these verses here deal specifically with the 30 chambers and the pavement around the outer court. Verse 17 gives a general description. Then he brought me into the outer court. So Ezekiel was now brought into through the eastern gate, which is you see there number 3 on the image there, through the eastern gate, and then he comes along the mid corridor, so that he's now standing inside the outer court. All right, he's come through the eastern gate into the outer court area, and lo, there were made for the court round about. What is he looking at now? Two things especially were made for the outer court, and these were, first of all, chambers, and second, a pavement. Now, this pavement was similar to that found in the Solomonic temple mentioned in 2 Chronicles 7 verse 3. 2 Chronicles 7 verse 3. It may easily have been a mosaic pavement, according to Esther 1 verse 6, Esther 1 verse 6, where similar terminology is actually used. Then Ezekiel now focuses on the 30 chambers which were upon the pavement. Now, these chambers had been built on the stone pavement and situated against the surrounding outer wall. Okay, there were 10 on the north wall, 10 on the east wall, and 10 on the south wall, making it the total of 30. And you can see them there, their item number 6 on that chart. All right, so west wall had a different building altogether. And we'll get to that when we come to chapter 41. Now, it could be surmised here that perhaps these chambers were arranged in 3 groups of 10 against the north, east, and south walls, with the gateways dividing them into 2 groups of 5 on either side of each gate, which is what we see on the image there. In other words, there were 10 on the north, east, and south sides, but there was also a gate in each wall, which could have divided each group of 10 chambers, 5 on each side of the gate. There's a visual for you there. The exact use of these 30 chambers is nowhere stated, and so we cannot be certain what their intended use is. They may have a similar use as the chambers of the inner wall, but we'll get to that later. In verse 18, he talks about the pavement, and the pavement was by the side of the gate. In other words, this pavement was laid along the walls on each side of all 3 gates. And then he says they were answerable, or what that means is they're corresponding to the length of the gate. So this pavement extended into the court, level with the gateway, making the length of it 44 cubits, because we would subtract the 6 cubits from that which made up the outer wall, giving us a total of about 23.5 meters. Now, this is the distance from the upper pavement of the inner court, and then he says even the lower pavement. So this section of pavement was in the outer court, while the upper pavement was in the inner court, because the inner court stood on a higher level than the outer court. And so it was lower than the pavement of the inner court. So we have the inner court was higher, outer court was lower. Okay. In verse 19, he then deals with the actual measure. And he measured the breadth from the forefront of the lower gate onto the forefront of the inner court without. So the lower gate is in the outer court, and the measurement is taken from the inner front of the gate to the outer court. So, and that's to the outer front of the gate to the inner court, all right? From the facing of one gate to the facing of the other gate. And this is the distance between the innermost face of the outer gate to the facing of the threshold of the corresponding gateway of the inner gate. So we're finding out how wide this corridor is. Now, this dimension was 100 cubits. So this means there was 100 cubits, or 53.5 meters of space between the facing of these 2 gates. And now this was true of each of the gates on the east, north, and south sides. This means there's approximately 53.5 meters between the outer and the inner walls. Now, having dealt with this space in between, he now turns to the other 2 gates, which is going to be, so that's the eastern gate. We're going to look at the northern and southern gate. There is no western gate. Northern gate we see in verses 20 to 23. And the gate of the outer court, whose prospect is toward the north, he measured the length thereof and the breadth thereof. The lodges thereof were 3 on this side, 3 on that side, and the posts thereof and the arches thereof were after the measure of the first gate. The length thereof was 50 cubits, breadth 5 and 20. And the windows thereof and the arches thereof and the palm trees thereof were after the measure of the gate, whose prospect is toward the east. And they went up on it by 7 steps, and the arches thereof were before them. And there was a gate to the inner court over against the other gate, both on the north and on the east. And he measured from gate to gate 100 cubits. So verses 20 to 23 now deal with the northern gate and the outer wall. All right, the outer wall, the northern gate. In verse 20, we come to the gate itself. It says the gate of the outer court, whose prospect is toward the north. So once, remember, the angel is taking Ezekiel for a guided tour. He starts at the east gate. So once they arrived there, the angel measured the length and the breadth thereof. The dimensions of this northern gate are going to be the same as the eastern gate. In fact, the only new information we have in this section is we have the 7 steps leading up to the gate from the outside through the outer wall. Now in verse 21, he summarizes the interior details. And the lodges thereof were 3 on this side and 3 on that side, and the posts and the arches were after the measure of the first gate. Posts and the arches had the same dimensions as what we had on the east gate, which he already told us about. Then he tells us the measurement. The length thereof was 50 cubits, the breadth 5 and 20 cubits, which is, I don't know, what is it? Oh gosh, I forgot what it is oh, there it is, it's over there. 27 by 13. 27 by 13 meters. And then in verse 22, he deals with the exterior details, which were after the measure of the gate, whose prospect is toward the east. What he's saying is the dimensions of the windows and arches with their palm trees, emblems, were the same as the eastern gate, because the prospect is toward the east. What he's saying is the same as the east. And they went up to it by 7 steps. So we learn from this that the whole temple area was higher than the ground around it, and it was reached by 7 steps at this point. And this is just to get into the outer court area. And the arches thereof were before them. The porch at the end of the gate was these 7 steps. In verse 23, we're given the dimensions of this outer court. There was a gate to the inner court over against the other gate. This means that both the north and east gates of the inner court were exactly opposite the corresponding north and east gates of the outer court. And he measured from gate to gate 100 cubits. Again, 100 cubits is what we see here is what, 27 meters or something. No, 50 meters, 50 something meters. Now, okay, yeah. So again, this is repeated information, and this is just confirming here that the dimensions of the space between the wall of the outer court and the wall of the inner court was that of the distance between the gates, which was 100 cubits. Now we go on to look at the southern gate. So we've done the eastern and northern. Now we have the southern gate. And he led, this is verse 24 to 27. And he led me toward the south, and behold, a gate toward the south, and he measured the posts thereof, the arches thereof, according to these measures. And there were windows in it, and in the arches thereof round about, like those windows. The length was 50 cubits, the breadth 5 and 20 cubits. And there were 7 steps to go up to it. The arches thereof were before them, and it had palm trees, one on this side and another on that side upon the post thereof. And there was a gate to the inner court toward the south, and he measured from gate to gate toward the south 100 cubits. So now he deals with the last gate on the south side, because there's no western gate. Now in verse 24, we come to the gate itself. And he led, this is the southern gate now. He led me toward the south, and behold, a gate toward the south. And he measured the posts thereof and the arches thereof according to these measures. So the dimensions of the southern gate and the outer wall were exactly the same as the northern and eastern gates. They're all the same. In verse 25, he spends some time dealing with the windows. There were windows in it, and in the arches thereof round about like those windows. And this is referring back to the windows of verses 13 and 15, which were in the guard rooms and the porch. The length was 50 cubits equals 27 meters. The breadth was 25 cubits, 13.5 meters. Now, in verse 26, he talks about the steps and the arches, and there were 7 steps to go up to it, and the arches thereof were before them, and it had palm trees, one on this side, one another on that side, same as we saw in verse 16. And in verse 27, he gives the measurements of the outer court again, and there was a gate, the inner court toward the south. So while he's standing here in the south gate of the outer court, Ezekiel noticed that there was a gate in the inner wall opposite to where he was standing. And he measured from gate to gate toward the south 100 cubits. 100 cubits. So this is the dimension. This is the dimension here between the outer and inner south gates. And as with the northern and eastern gates, it was 100 cubits, which is around about 53 meters. So this brings us to the end of the outer court. Now we're going to move from here into the inner court. All right. So we have the southern gate. He's now down at the south side in the outer court. He's looking across into the inner court, southern gate. Then he brought me to the inner court by the south gate, and he measured the south gate according to these measures, and the lodges thereof, and the posts thereof, and the arches thereof according to these measures. And there were windows in it, and in the arches thereof round about it. It was 50 cubits long, and 25 cubits broad. And there were arches round about, 25 cubits long, and 5 cubits broad. And the arches thereof were toward the outer court, and palm trees were upon the posts thereof, and the ascent to it had 8 steps. Now, he begins to discuss the inner court in verses 28 to 31. He deals with the southern gate of the inner court. Verse 28, then he brought me to the inner court by the south gate. Now, nowhere does Ezekiel specifically mention an inner wall. But the fact that there are inner gates obviously requires that there needs to be an inner wall to put the gates in, because the gates were built through walls. So from his position at the south side of the outer court, where we left him in verse 27, Ezekiel now enters the inner court through the southern gate in the inner wall. And he measured the south gate according to these measures. The design of the inner gates were a mirror image of the outer gates in the outer wall. As we've already seen, they were directly opposite each other and separated by a distance of 53 meters. The only difference between the gates of the inner wall and those of the outer wall was the vestibule, which was facing in a different manner. The vestibule of the outer gate faced toward the outer wall, while the vestibules of the inner gates faced toward the outer court. So this means that the vestibule would be on the opposite side of the gate. If they were on the same side as those of the outer court, then they'd be facing the temple. However, according to Ezekiel, they're facing the outer court. And so both the vestibules of the outer and inner gates were facing the outer court. So obviously, from their structure, they were facing in the opposite direction away from the temple. So the gates to the inner and outer courts correspond to each other in every respect, except for the position of the porch. The porch of the outer court gates lay at the inner end of the gateway, while the porch of the inner court gates were situated at the outer end, facing the porch of the outer court gates. And the diagram there should sort of help you to work it out. Okay. In verse 29, Ezekiel now deals with the interior details of this gate. It was according to these measures, meaning that the dimensions were the same as the outer gate, and that included the lodges, the posts, the arches. Concerning the windows, he says there were windows in it, that is, in the lodges, and in the arches thereof round about. The length and breadth were the same as the other gates, 27 meters by 13.5 meters. The arches in verse 30 were round about. They were built either against or into the wall of the inner court, and their dimensions were 13.5 meters by 2.7 meters. Pretty big. Now, in verse 31, he deals with the exterior details. The arches thereof were toward the outer court. That is the first difference here between the outer and inner gates. These arches face toward the outer court in the opposite direction to the outer gates. And the palm trees were upon the post thereof, and the ascent to it had 8 steps. And that's the second difference. Here we have 8 steps. Outer gates had 7 steps from ground level, if you like, from outside the temple compound leading up to them. There were 7 steps to get up into the outer court. And then, but the inner court now was raised a further 8 steps above the level of the outer court by these other 8 steps. And then in verse 32 to 34, we see the eastern gate. This is the inner court. He brought me into the inner court towards the east, and he measured the gate according to these measures. And the lodges thereof, and the posts thereof, and the arches thereof, according to these measures. And there were windows therein, and the arches thereof round about. It was 50 cubits long and 25 wide or broad. And the arches thereof were toward the outer court, and palm trees were upon the posts thereof on this side and on that side. And the ascent to it had 8 steps. Now, in dealing with this inner eastern gate in these verses, 32 to 34, Ezekiel is now brought into the inner court toward the east. And he measured the gate according to these measures. Okay? This means the dimensions are once again the same as those of the southern gate of the inner court on the south side. In verse 33, he first gives the interior detail again. Everything was the same. It says, according to these measures, including the lodges, the posts, and the arches. The windows were the same, situated in the lodges and the arches. Dimensions were the same, 50 by 25, cubits 27 by 13 meters. In verse 34, we're now given the interior details. The arches thereof were toward the outer court, and palm trees were upon the posts thereof on this side and on that side, and the ascent to it had 8 steps. And so, here we go again. The inner wall of the eastern gate was the same as that of the southern gate in both dimensions and design. Nothing's changed. In 35 to 37, the northern gate. And he brought me to the north gate, and he measured it according to these measures. The lodges thereof, the posts thereof, the arches thereof. And there were windows therein round about. Length was 50 cubits, the breadth 25 cubits. And the posts thereof were toward the outer court, and palm trees were upon the posts thereof, on this side and on that side, and the ascent to it had 8 steps. The point here is that this northern gate of the inner court wall had the same design and dimensions as the eastern and southern gates of the inner wall. And then in verse 35, he introduces us to the gate itself, and he brought me to the north gate. So now he's dealing with the inner northern gate, and he measured it according to these measures. And the point here is that the dimensions were exactly the same as that of the southern gate and the eastern inner gate. Verse 36 confirms that the same interior measurements of the lodges, posts, and arches, and the windows in them. The area was 50 by 25 cubits, 27 by 13 meters, approximately. Verse 37 confirms the same exterior details. It says the posts thereof were toward the outer court with their palm tree emblem on each side. And again, it was approached by 8 ascending steps. So once again, everything is exactly the same as the inner gates of the southern and eastern inner walls. Now we go to the chambers and the tables for the preparation of sacrifices in verse 38 to 43. And the chamber with the door thereof was by the post at the gates, There they washed the burnt offering. And in the porch of the gate were 2 tables on this side, 2 tables on that side, to slay thereon the burnt offering and the sin offering and the trespass offering. And on the one side without, as one goes up to the entry of the gate toward the north, there were 2 tables. And on the other side, which belonged to the porch of the gate, there were 2 tables. 4 tables were on this side and 4 tables that side, by the side of the gate. 8 tables whereupon they slew the sacrifices. And there were 4 tables for the burnt offering of hewn stone, 1.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits broad, and 1 cubit high, whereupon they laid the instruments wherewith they slew the burnt offering and the sacrifice. And the hooks, a handbreadth long, were fastened within round about, and upon the tables was the flesh of the oblation. So here in verses 38 to 42, we have another feature of the inner court, where these chambers and tables for the preparation of the sacrifices. 38, he deals with the chambers, and a chamber with the door thereof was by the posts at the gates. So here he notes the cells and the arrangements for the sacrificial worship by and in the inner court. And the equipment for dealing with the sacrifices was to be found on the tables. Now, although he only mentions the tables of the northern gate of the inner wall, it might very well be true that similar tables were to be found at the eastern and southern gates. On the other hand, these things may only have been found at the northern gate, in keeping with the fact that in the tabernacle system, the sacrifices were slain on the north side of the altar, according to Leviticus 1, verse 1. Leviticus 1, verse 1. Verse 11. 1, verse 11. Leviticus 1, verse 11. In any case, there is where they wash the burnt offerings, meaning in the inner court at the inner north gate. That's where they washed them all. And the reason it could mean only the northern gate of the inner wall, this is where it's taking place, was because of this. Just before this time, Ezekiel was at the inner northern gate, and in the tabernacle, that's where the sacrifices were slain. Now, in verses 39 to 41, he deals with the 8 slaughter tables. The first 4 we deal with in verse 39, and in the porch of the gate, meaning in the inner space of the porch of the northern gate in the inner wall, so we're inside, there were 2 tables on this side and 2 tables on that side. And so the purpose of these tables was to slay thereon. There were 3 types of offerings: burnt offering, the sin offering, and the trespass offering. And then in verse 40, he now deals with the second set of 4 tables. And on one side without, as one goeth up toward the entry of the gate toward the north, there were 2 tables. And on the north, and on the other side, which belonged to the porch of the gate, were 2 tables. So 4 tables stood beyond the porch of the northern gate, of the north gate, within the gateway towards the inner court, which was reached by these 8. So you've got to go up these 8 steps to get into the inner court, and these tables were sited 2 to the east and 2 to the west of this northern gate. Okay. So in verse 41, the total number of tables is given. It says, by the side of the gate were 8 tables, whereupon they slew the sacrifices. So 4 tables stood on each side of the porch of the gateway. 2 stood inside, and 2 were against the outer wall. So there were 8 tables in all being used for the slaughter of the sacrifices. In verses 42 to 43, he talks about the, did I just do that? No, about the other 4 tables, about 4 other tables, in addition to the 8 just mentioned. Yeah, there are 8 tables that are actually used for the slaughtering of the sacrifices, and then there were 4 tables which were used for the placing of the instruments for the sacrifice. Verse 42 gives the individual dimensions of these 4 tables. There were 4 tables for the burnt offerings of hewn stone, 1.5 cubits long, and a cubit and a half broad. In other words, they were, I don't know, what's a cubit again? A cubit is half a meter. So there were a cubit and a half, so around about 3/4 of a meter. Oh, no, a cubit and a half. Yeah, about 3/4 of a meter. Yeah, 3/4 of a meter. They were 1 cubit high, whereupon they laid the instruments wherewith they slew the burnt offerings and the sacrifice. So we have tables, tables, tables. So these 4 tables here were not actually used for slaughter, but they were used to hold the instruments. And they would include the knives and the receptacles for the blood. And the exact position of these 4 tables is not identified as with the slaughter tables. It doesn't actually tell us where they are. In verse 43, he mentions one of the actual instruments, the hooks, a handbreadth long, which should be around about 90 mil, something like that, 90 mil. They were fastened within round about, and upon the tables was the flesh of the oblation. So that's that lot. Now, next segment, we see the chambers for the priests, and this is in verses 44 to 46. And this is number 13 on the chart there. And without the inner gate were chambers for the singers in the inner court, which was at the side of the north gate, and their prospect was toward the south, one at the side of the east gate having the prospect toward the north. And he said unto me, this chamber, whose prospect is toward the south, is for the priests, the keepers of the charge of the house. And the chamber whose prospect is toward the north is for the priests, the keepers of the charge of the altar. These are the sons of Zadok, who from among the sons of Levi come near to Jehovah to minister to him. So now, this passage deals with the chambers for the priests, which are introduced in verse 44. And without the inner gate were chambers for the singers in the inner court. These chambers were not actually within the gateway, but in the inner court, located on the north and south sides of the inner court, at the side of the north gate. And their prospect was toward the south. So the entrance to these chambers on both sides of the north gate were facing south. One at the side of the east gate having the prospect toward the north. So there is also a chamber at the side of the east gate with its entrance facing north. As I said, you got to be an architect to work out all these things. Now in verse 45, he deals with the north side. And he said to me, this is in an area. And he said to me that this chamber, whose prospect is toward the south, so it was on the north side, is for the priests, the keepers of the charge of the house. Now, these priests were also members of the tribe of Levi, or they were Levites, which we're going to see when we get down to chapter 44, verse 9 to 14. So this north side was for the priests who were responsible for the day-to-day running of the temple. And these would be the non-Zadokite priests. They were members of the tribe of Levi, but not specifically descended from one particular Levite named Zadok. We're going to see him later on as we get through the book. In verse 46, he tells us about the south side. And the chamber whose prospect was toward the north, hence they were on the south side, they're facing north. This was for the priests, the keepers of the altar. So here, Ezekiel is dealing with a select group of priests who were in charge of the actual sacrificing. These are the sons of Zadok.
Yep.
Why am I hearing Lisa? So these were the sons of where am I? And he points out that these men came from among the sons of Levi. In other words, they are descended from a specific segment of the tribe of Levi. Now, Zadok and the Zadokites became prominent when the house of Eli was set aside. And we see this in 1 Samuel 2, 27 to 36. 1 Samuel 2, 27 to 36. Remember, Zadok was a priest in King David's day who was loyal to both David and Solomon. And we read about this in 1 Kings 1:8, 1 Kings 1:8, and 1 Kings 2:26, 1 Kings 2:26. So because Zadok had proved to be a loyal priest in their day, eventually his house was to replace the house of Eli. And Eli was displaced according to 1 Samuel 2, 27 to 36. 1 Samuel 2, 27 to 36. Now, these Zadokites will be mentioned several times in this section of the book of Ezekiel. We're going to see them later on in chapters 43, chapter 44, and chapter 48. In dealing with the priestly system here, there'll be the Levites, who will be the caretakers of the temple compound. But then we're going to see that there'll be one specific segment of the tribe of Levi, the descendants of Zadok, who are going to be in charge of the actual sacrifice themselves. So these, verse says, will come near to Jehovah to minister unto him. So in other words, only Zadokite priests will have access to the altar and to the temple itself. So the chamber on the south side, which was facing north, was for these priests who were in charge of the sacrifices and the altar. And we're going to see that when we get there into chapter 44, verses 15 to 31. Okay, so hopefully you can have a look over those images later on and just refresh yourself with them. Okay, that's where we will finish in this session. Study hard, grow strong, and we'll see you in around about 3 weeks' time. Thank you for coming along.